And I think the conclusion that they have gradually reached is that, especially in the aftermath of the Iranian elections, it's very difficult to reach a modus vivendi with a regime in Tehran which seemingly needs us, the United States, as an adversary. That you have individuals who are now running Iran, and I would put Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei in this category, believe that enmity towards the United States was a fundamental pillar of the 1979 revolution, and it's central to the identity of the Islamic Republic. And I think that US policy towards Iran is nicely bookended by two quotes from Henry Kissinger. And the first quote from Kissinger was several years back, and he said that, and I think this will surprise some of you, because Kissinger is kind of the preeminent realist thinker in the United States. He said, this is a verbatim quote, he said, there are few countries on earth with whom the United States has more common interests and less reason to quarrel than Iran. And so these issues I mentioned earlier, Afghanistan, Iraq, energy security, etc., the United States and Iran have tremendous overlapping interests, national interests, and there's tremendous venues for the United States and Iran to build confidence. But I think the second quote from Kissinger really is more incisive and a better description of the current conundrum. He says that Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause. If it's a nation, it acts in its national interests. Again, there's plenty of overlapping interests between the two. But if it's a cause, if it acts like a cause and it wants to continue to forward this revolutionary ideology both at home and beyond its borders, then we're going to continue to butt heads. And again, I think that the challenge now, there's two overarching challenges, I think, facing the Obama administration. And the first is, how do you reach a modus vivendi with a regime which needs you as an adversary? And second, how do you go about trying to engage the Iranian government without betraying the millions of Iranian people who believe their government is illegitimate? So I think that the template which they're increasingly going to be looking at Iran is US foreign policy towards the Soviet Union in the 1980s, in the sense that there was a high-level dialogue taking place between the two countries. The conflict between the two countries was, or there was an effort to contain the conflict between the two countries. I don't think there were any illusions that the conflict was going to be resolved, but there was an effort to contain the conflict. But at the same time, there was a tremendous and consistent expression of solidarity with people and the moral support, not for individuals. President Obama is never going to come out and say, I support Hussein Mousavi or Mehdi Karabi. I'm not sure if you can pronounce this. But there will be support for principles like democracy and human rights. So I think this is a very difficult balance, but I think if any US president can maintain this balance, it's perhaps President Obama. So why don't I stop my comments there? Hopefully, maybe you can disagree with what I said. Thanks so much. Should I be taking questions? Okay. Please, in the back.
Karim, thank you first for coming to Caltech and addressing us. The question I had, brief two-part question. If the Obama administration has interacted more differently with Iran than any other administration before it, why then is it still adamant about pointless sanctions that ultimately won't be enforceable? What or who is ultimately preventing the counterintuitive move of lifting sanctions and at least offering to economically engage Iran as we would India, for instance?
Okay, this one. It's a great question. I think that, first of all, I think the driving force behind the sanctions has much more to do with Congress than it does the Obama administration. If you follow these things, you'll notice that Congress was ready to pursue very vigorous sanctions against Iran immediately upon President Obama's entering office, but they tried to delay it as much as possible. I can tell you my own evolution of thinking with regards to sanctions. If we were having this conversation, say, a year ago, I would have told you that sanctions have no positive track record in Iran. I can't tell you that sanctions have achieved anything positive over the course of the last 3 decades. And on the contrary, I would argue that if you're dealing with a regime, if you're dealing with hardliners who want an adversarial relationship with the United States, and they thrive in isolation, then sanctions is almost a gift to them. Because I describe these individuals as weeds that grow in the dark. You know, they thrive in isolation, but you expose them to light, and I think they wilt. And so I think that certainly if you're looking over the course of the last 3 decades, I think we would have had much more success by trying to engage Iran and open up its economy and reintegrate it into the international community, etc. I think that, that being said, as I said earlier, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei is not an idiot. He's been in power for 21 years now. And he understands this argument very well. And I think for precisely that reason, he's also been very resistant to any types of overtures from the United States in opening economic or political openings. But let me tell you how my thinking has shifted in the aftermath of the elections. I think now that for me there was some fundamental shifts which took place on June 15th in the aftermath of the elections. And I think that from a political vantage point, given the fact that after 1 year, the Obama administration hasn't really gotten any return on investment for its engagement approach. There haven't been any meaningful Iranian overtures or meaningful Iranian compromises as a result of this. Politically, it's very difficult to obviously lift sanctions. But I think secondly, we've reached a point where this is, what's taking place now in Iran, I would describe as the most serious existential crisis facing the Islamic Republic since the revolution. And I think at a time when they're under tremendous duress and pressure, both internally and internationally, lifting sanctions, I fear would actually would lift a lot of the pressure which the regime is experiencing now. So the way I look at it is that a year ago, say, when the administration was looking at sanctions, they were looking at it exclusively in the context of how might these sanctions or punitive measures alter Iran's nuclear calculations. And the effect that these sanctions may have on the Iranian population was not really being considered at all. And in the aftermath of the elections now, I think the sanctions and other punitive measures are increasingly being looked at in the context of how might these measures be potentially helpful or potentially hurtful to the cause of the opposition. And if you've noticed the word that Secretary Clinton has used to describe sanctions, last year she would use the adjective, quote unquote, crippling sanctions. Now the adjective they're using to describe sanctions is targeted sanctions. And increasingly the focus of these targeted sanctions is the institution of the Revolutionary Guards. And the Revolutionary Guards are a somewhat convenient target because they're the group which is managing the nuclear program. They're the group which is liaising with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and other radical groups throughout the region. And they're the group which is overseeing the brutalization of the Iranian population. And so I don't think, my own personal perception is that if you can target sanctions on the Revolutionary Guards, and there's never going to be a 100% precise target, that's true. But if you can try to target the Revolutionary Guards, who have turned into Iran's largest company, basically, they've turned into a giant mafia, and you can make it more difficult for them to sign these billion-dollar contracts with multilateral corporations throughout the world, and you can turn them into an international pariah, I think that could potentially be beneficial to the cause of reform movement in Iran. And I have to say that in my time in Iran, US sanctions have been in place on Iran for 3 decades. I think when you talk to Iranians about the state of the economy, this is a generalization, but it's certainly my experience, and you ask people, about their economic difficulties, I think very few people will tell you that the economy would be doing really well if it weren't for US sanctions. On the contrary, everyone says the economic malaise is because of corruption and mismanagement. So I find it difficult to believe that if there are targeted multilateral sanctions against the Revolutionary Guards, that it's going to compel people to rally around the group which has been brutalizing them the last 8 months. And your argument is a good one, and it's a valid one. But I think if you're the president, you really have no other options, because you have a Congress which, when they vote on sanctions resolutions, they vote 100% to 0% in favor of them. And I think a lot of the reality about sanctions is Iran's orientation towards Israel. And the former, one of President Bush's former speechwriters, a guy called David Frum, once told me something which, when you think about history, he said to me, you can enrich uranium and you can call for Israel to be wiped off the map, but you can't do both of these at the same time. And so I think that Iran would be able to get away with a lot of what it wants to do in the nuclear realm if it were to change its threatening orientation towards Israel and to stop denying the Holocaust. But when they issue that type of rhetoric towards Israel and they continue to materially, financially support and arm groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, given the tremendous passion within the United States and within the US Congress for Israel's security, I think that the Obama administration has no other option but to pursue these sanctions. And I think what they're trying to do is to target them as much as possible against the government and as little as possible against the people. Please in the back.
Question regarding the position of Ayatollah Khamenei. Is there any foreseeable position where, based on the fact that if he were to die, that there would be some sort of internal civil war between the ruling factions? And does the United States have a position towards that, as far as preparing for a post-Khamenei or even post-sufficient leadership Iran?
So I think Khamenei is actually 70 now, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a lot of rumors about his ill health, that he suffers from depression and prostate cancer. And constitutionally, if he were to drop dead next week, the entity which is in charge of his succession is called the Majlis Khabrigan, the Assembly of Experts, which is this group of about 84 clerics, and I joke that their average age is deceased. Whole group of individuals. And I have a tough time believing that if Khamenei were to drop dead next week, the Revolutionary Guards would simply sit on the sidelines and say, well, decide for us who is going to be our next supreme leader, please.